Okay, so now we have the final talk for the day. Another highlight with Atif Mian. He will talk about inequality and macrofinance. Atif, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Marcus. Good to see all of you. So I will talk about just a broader motivation first, thinking about macrofinance in the long run. The traditional way of thinking about macrofinance is to think of macrofinance linkages at a business cycle frequency. So if you think of like financial crises, where they come from, why do they amplify, what are the real consequences of those financial imbalances and so on, how should monetary policy, fiscal policy respond, all of those questions, whether on theoretical or empirical side, the common theme in all of that is that you're essentially thinking at business cycle frequency, right? And so because of that, you make certain important decisions. So for example, you might think that certain frictions are important, but none of that stuff, almost by design, is going to be important in the long run. Because if it is, then you're not really talking about the business cycle, you're talking about something else as well, right? So what I'm trying to highlight here is that there is a leftover question which can actually be quite important, that macrofinance literature, when it focuses on business cycles, almost by design, by construction, by the nature of the question, it tends not to focus on, which is there a question about macrofinance linkages in the long run? So I want to smooth over the cycles, and I want to think of secular trends and things of that sort, right? To put it differently, I mean, one way you could have thought about this question, even though I'm not going to talk about it today from that perspective, but you could think about sort of, for example, macrofinance linkages in the growth framework, right? That's another way of thinking about these issues. So that's sort of a broad motivation first, and I just want to bring that to your attention because I think that's a very interesting and important area of exploration that especially within macrofinance literature, has not been explored as much as it really deserves to be explored. Okay? And today what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about 4 papers of mine that try to kind of think about that question revolving around the role of inequality in sort of making those macrofinance linkages over the long run. So that's what I'm going to try and do. Now, of course, there could be other forces as well that are at play in thinking about those macrofinance linkages in the long run. I'm not going to be talking about other potential sort of variables that might be important. I'm going to keep my focus on inequality. Okay. So let's think about that question of macrofinance linkages again over this longer horizon. And what's the, you need to start somewhere, right? You need some premise that is useful to say, okay, because of this micro foundation, there might actually be a link, a possible link, and then we'll sort of investigate that link, how far we can take it, and also think about the empirical data and whether we can see some verification of those ideas. So that's what I'm going to do largely. So what's the premise or the motivating kind of empirical evidence that there may be a connection between macro and finance in the long run? Well, one way is to think of the demand side first, so the consumption saving decision, and say, okay, is there a reason there might be a connection between macro finance in the long run, given how people behave when making their consumption saving decision? And from that perspective, again, consumption saving, by the way, is one of the most important decisions that households make in any economy, and certainly from a macro finance perspective. Because what you save is essentially then they will try to channel it through the financial sector, and that's really where the macro financial connection comes into play, right? So it's a natural starting point. It's not like I'm picking it out of thin air. It's just a natural starting point to think of the consumption saving decision. And when you look at sort of people's work of how people make those consumption saving decisions, there are many different aspects of it, of course, a lot of behavioral work and so on. But again, we are thinking about the longer run, right? And one thing I'll say about behavioral work is that, again, a lot of that work is very important, but it tends to be more business cycle frequency, if you will, right? So think of the work that will talk about people, extrapolation of the past into the future, even when underlying stuff is random walk and so on. Well, it might give you cycles, but it's hard to take that kind of work and say, okay, this is really important in the long run. Okay, so we really want to think of what kind of micro data is really, or micro evidence, I should say, is really useful for thinking about the long run. And for that reason, I'm going to focus on one particular parameter, which is the tendency to save out of lifetime or permanent income. Okay, so this is important to highlight that this is not necessarily, there is a lot of literature on heterogeneous agent, for example, but a large fraction of that is based around thinking about MPC heterogeneity in the face of temporary shocks, right? Which again is a business cycle question. So if you just have that kind of MPC, you're not going to generate differences in the long run, because in the long run, if people have very similar tendencies to save out of permanent or lifetime income, it's not going to, what did I say? If they have very similar tendencies, it's not going to generate important differences in the long run, okay, for obvious reasons. And so the important starting point is that people have looked at this question. So this chart is coming from one paper in the JPE, I think 2004. But there's a fair bit of other work as well. And it gives this very intuitive answer that kind of what we see, the kind of heterogeneity we see in the face of temporary shocks, it kind of holds for permanent, in the face of permanent income questions as well. So in particular, people tend to save if they are very rich, again in permanent income or wealth terms. They tend to save a higher fraction of their permanent income relative to the rest of the population. Okay, so let's just take that as, let's not challenge this, but take this as given. So hence fact number one. Fact number two that all of you are very well aware of, very well documented, the share of income going to the top 1% has been rising, especially from 80s onwards, not just in the US, but in almost all advanced economies, right? The pace and scale might differ, but it's been trending upwards. That's quite well known. And in more recent decades, even in fast-growing economies like China. And so the question is, if you put these two facts together, what are the implications, just first of all from a conceptual perspective, just as a theoretical exercise, if you will, a hypothetical exercise, if you will, that given these two facts, what are the likely consequences from a macro finance perspective, okay? And I think that exercise is quite useful because it illustrates some important insights, but equally importantly, some important additional questions that I really think are very useful for all of you to think about. I'll try to highlight some of them, but if you ask more questions, then hopefully together we will come up with more additional interesting questions as well. So feel free to give your comments or ask any questions, especially if what I'm saying is not making any sense, okay? All of you are very smart, so you can all read papers. I'm not going to go through you can, the papers, I'll talk about which paper and you can read the details of the paper. So I'll try to give you kind of the basic intuition and try to sort of highlight the main points. What comes out of this premise, again, the only premise essentially is that people have preferences are non-homothetic. That's another way of saying that, right? That the very rich, they tend to have higher saving rate out of, again, lifetime or permanent income. So mathematically, that means that preferences are non-homothetic, with respect to income share that the very rich are receiving. And once you embed that in otherwise, it's a very standard, simple framework, you get this exposed, at least very obvious result, which collectively we are going to refer to as indebted demand. So let me explain what that is. So this is the paper, the title of the paper is also indebted demand. And the basic idea of this paper is that in such a world where those two facts exist, fact number one and fact number two, when you put them together, something happens in this economy in the long run, again, in the secular sense of the word, not business cycle sense, which is that over time, you need to create demand somehow, because more and more share of the income is going to people who are saving it at a higher rate, okay? Now, the key question here is, and this is actually a very important question to think about, both theoretically and empirically. We do explore this question theoretically, so that's in the paper. But there's also a very interesting empirical question here, which is generally in the standard sort of when we talk about macro 101 in undergrad and so on, we say savings equals investment. So anything that I do to increase saving, in this case by increasing inequality, you'll say that's great news, right? If you increase in saving, you can invest more, right? But that is taken as a tautology, of course, that all the saving can be invested. But in fact, if you actually go into sort of the micro foundation of those kind of models, they assume that you're always kind of equaling marginal product of capital with the first order condition on the consumer side of the Euler equation, right? Empirically, however, when you actually look at the data, what is quite interesting is that while if you take interest rate as sort of cost of capital as one measure of that, while that has trended downwards, investment has not risen at all, right? In fact, investment to GDP has also trended downwards. Now, again, there's a big debate on whether you're measuring it correctly and so on. My reading of that thing is that even with all those caveats, at best, it's staying flat. It certainly hasn't gone up. And so investment, in other words, is quite, and more micro data kind of says the same thing, that investment is not very responsive to like cost of capital shocks. Okay, so investment in the aggregate looks quite inelastic. For example, there are major corporations sitting on a bunch of cash, and they are not investing, right? In fact, in some years, the corporate sector as a whole has been running surpluses. That is to say, it hasn't actually borrowed from the remaining household and government sectors. That's quite actually remarkable, given our sort of standard traditional ways of thinking about investment and so on. So I think that deserves a lot of careful scrutiny. I'm not going to say anything about that. I don't have much insight into this other than saying that perhaps stuff like monopoly power, concentration, maybe that has a role to play and so on. But I think there's a lot more that can or should be done, and so I'm not going to take that. Just to keep things simple, why am I highlighting all of this? Because obviously you could take all of those savings and put them into capital formation, right? I'm not going to do that initially by just dropping the investment question and saying, okay, investment is just fixed, and on the margin it's not going to go into investment. You can see in the paper we actually, as one should, relax that it doesn't change the results much, and I'm happy to talk about that in patient. But just to clarify the basic insight, let's just assume that investment is inelastic. Is this clear? It's true in the data. It's very I think it's a deeper question, so that's why I'm highlighting this, because it's a very interesting question. So let's just for now take as given that investment is inelastic. What's going to happen now? Well, what's going to happen now is that something has to give as inequality rises and the very rich save at a higher fraction of this. Because by the way, another important fact about the rise in inequality is, and this really goes into, by the way, into the details of, when we have these Ayagari style models in the background, do we really believe in those models? How important are those and so on? It's important to look at sort of the facts of the nature of the rise in inequality. So one important fact about the nature of the rise in inequality, at least as I look at the data, read the evidence that people have put together, is that it's very persistent over. So it's not just that inequality is rising. It's not the case that today the richest person is Jeff Bezos and tomorrow the richest person is like Atif Mian. Unfortunately, that's not true. It's always Jeff Bezos and it's never Atif Mian, right? But the point is that it seems like the rise in inequality is a rise in permanent income for the top 1%, right? So it's a persistent in that sense. Anyways, the point is that saving has to go somewhere, and the economy will try to accommodate that necessity, that it has to go somewhere, because otherwise this economy is supplying more than it's demanding, right? And that's not an equilibrium. So how does the economy generate demand? Well, the only way this economy can generate demand, given that I've for now shut down the investment margin, the only way this economy can generate demand is for someone to borrow from the rich and spend it. This can happen by higher mortgages, credit card spending, whatever it might be. But that is one way this economy can go back to the same full employment equilibrium. And that's what we refer to as indebted demand. The creation of demand through debt in the face of rising inequality, that's what we are calling, the whole process we are referring to as indebted demand. Now, the thing about indebted demand is that it has some peculiar features that have longer run implications and hence more permanent implications. So what are those? Let's think through that. If you take the first stage of what I'm describing here, inequality rises, demand tends to go down, all else equal. That's not possible. So the reaction from the economy, endogenous reaction, is that financial markets will try and lend to those with higher MPC out of permanent income. And how will they try and do that? Well, the one important way financial sector can try and do that is by lowering the interest rate, right? So they borrow and they like it, so everybody's happy, right? So by the way, welfare question, it's not that I'm saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying the new economy is different, right? The problem, however, is that now that has happened at, let's say, t plus 1. T plus 2, if the same fundamentals persist, you again have that problem in t plus 2. But you now actually have an additional problem, which is you've taken on more debt in t plus 1. And that debt has a particular direction. It has gone from the top 1% to somewhere in the middle of the distribution, most likely, right? And the additional problem in t plus 2 is that debt also has to be serviced now, right? Not only, so why is that important, by the way, that debt has to be serviced? Given the micro foundations of this framework, why is that fact important?
Growth and output is pretty deterministic.
Say that again?
Growth and output is pretty deterministic here, seems like.
Output for now is exogenous. Yeah, so we are just thinking about whether demand is high enough or not. So why is debt servicing relevant here?
It increases inequality.
Yeah, exactly. It's a transfer. What is debt servicing in this framework? Debt servicing is a transfer from those who borrowed back to those who lent. But remember the that's why I hinted at the micro foundation, the asymmetry between the two. That when they give up $1, they have to cut back their consumption 1 for 1 to give the dollar back to the lender. But the lender is not going to spend 1 for 1 for the dollar that they received. So they will try and save that interest income, a portion of it at least, once again. You see the logic of that? And so now the debt itself that was created to sort of balance the economy in the previous period, the next period, that debt actually imposes a headwind on demand because of all of the debt service payment that is due back to the top 1% from somewhere in the remaining population. Is this clear? So that's the key concept, that once you rely on debt to generate demand, now debt itself will tend to put downward pressure on the interest rates. And that's the way there's going to be this persistent now decline in the interest rate. So why is this model different now from kind of the standard models? By standard models, I mean models that don't have this non-homotheticity. Models that don't have this non-homotheticity, any such transfer in the long run has no implication, because borrowers and lenders, they have the same MPC out of permanent income. And it is for that reason that equilibrium interest rate, R star, right, the natural rate of interest, it's a very important object in all of our macro models. It always goes back to the same point where it was. Is this clear? The natural rate of interest, or R star, does not go back. In fact, it continues to decline for all the reasons as long as inequality is rising. Okay? So now we have a different way of thinking about in this framework, R star does not go back. Question, a bunch of questions. Let me start from here. Yes.
Am I right in thinking this should be falling at an accelerating rate by this dynamic?
No, it does not. It's a good question. The reason, or one of the reasons it does not, is you have to think of the inframarginal effects as well. So when interest rate declines, the debt that I was servicing in the past at higher interest rate, all of that is now a lower transfer. So no, it does not. Yep.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, would inflation then, like, equilibrate this problem? Because it seems like if you're increasing the transfers from the poor to the rich, but if they're all
Yeah.
nominal interest rates, if you just jack up inflation, it would offset.
Great question. The short answer to your question is everything is real in this model, right? So I'm talking about R star, the real rate of interest, and everything is real. So inflation is not there. Now, you could introduce inflation like the standard way, and nothing will change as long as inflation is anchored and all of that stuff. The typical Taylor rule where you're anchoring. That will not change anything in the long run. In the short run, actually, it does change. Maybe I'll if I have time, I'll talk about that. So that's interesting. But in general, I think your intuition is exactly right, which is that if I can raise inflation in unexpected ways, which will transfer real resources towards the debtor class, that helps. So we talk about that sort of stuff, but we don't have to think of it in inflation terms. There's another way of thinking about it as well, which actually just happened. Student debt relief or debt relief in general, right? Debt jubilees in general. You will see that over time that pressure will build up in this model. So actually it's all, that's one of the predictions that you'll see, Elizabeth Warrens of the world become more important over time. But here's the twist in that story. It doesn't help. Debt relief does not really help. Again, in the long run sense of the, remember, we're not short term here. We're not thinking about elections. In the long run, it doesn't really help. Why? Because the structural parameters are the same, so you're going to go back to the same equilibrium, ultimately. But it does help in the short run. It is true that in the short run, it acts like a boost. It gives you more space and all of that. There is another implication of these forces. If you do bring nominal rigidities into play, if I have time, as I said, I'll talk about that. It's sort of interesting. But again, to keep things simple, it's all real. R star, the interest rate, I'm just talking about everything in real terms.
And do we see that the real rate has declined with
Yes.
inequality, or is it just nominal?
Yes. I'm going to show you.
Okay.
Okay. Any other question? Yeah.
I don't understand why the rate of interest doesn't fall down suddenly because there is oversupply of savings. Why?
I'm just for, so that, right. So it in general, if it's a shock kind of a thing, yes, interest rate can jump as well. But what I am focusing on is the new steady states. So again, because we are all talking about long run, I'm just transition dynamic, I'm just not talking about it. But the paper solves for it, so you can actually see the, if there are jumps and so on, you can see the transition path as well. You can solve for it, obviously. But yeah, when I say the result will be lower interest rate and all of that, I'm referring to the new steady state. Because again, that's the natural way, or at least the first thing to talk about. And then, but it's transition dynamics are important, and they're all in the papers if you want to see the, Okay. And so this economy, so what happens, let me just sort of close the full story here. What happens in this economy is that as inequality rises, you need more debt to generate demand, but R star, the steady state long run interest rate, must fall for this economy to sustain this new equilibrium, which is higher inequality and higher debt. Okay? And notice that there is nothing important about welfare that we can say here, right? You can say, yeah, the rich want to save, they are happy. The less rich, they are still consuming, right? And what if they have more debt? Well, it's lower interest rate. So yeah, and that's true. The problem comes in when you get closer and closer to effective lower bound or zero lower bound, whatever you want to call it, right? If in general, I think of this effective lower bound and zero lower bound conversation as more in reduced form ways, as like some notion that interest rates cannot keep going low and low forever, right? And we sometimes, it could be literally a zero lower bound, but it doesn't have to be. There are other things that start kicking in. when interest rates are very low. Let me just give you two examples, because that's also an interesting question. So one is that very low rates could increase financial instability, right? Because it just becomes harder to value stuff at very low R, right? Because you're discounting things by interest rate and so on. So financial fragility is higher. People have obviously talk about it. It's an interesting research question, how exactly to model it and formulate it. Another, and I'll just highlight it here. So this is my work with Ernest Liu here, my colleague at Princeton, and Amir Sufi. We talk about this, which is that very low interest rates are not good for competition. So they raise concentration, which actually acts like a drag through the supply side of the economy because of rising concentration. I won't go through the full argument, but basically, the broader thing I just do want to highlight is that our typical macro models, they can have this tendency that like one variable solves all problems, right? You change the fundamentals of the economy, and yeah, R star shifts, and you're back to kind of perfection, right? You're back to the equilibrium and so on. So if the economy needs lower R star, like so what, right? But there may be other things like financial instability, like this supply side effects on competition, but there could be others, right? So it's an interesting question of it may not be just about that one variable can solve all margins, right? Obviously, again, an important concept in macro independently as well. So if you keep pushing on that, at some point you reach that effective lower bound, which is like some of these trade-offs, they start catching up to you. And you start suffering in the aggregate, that your aggregate output will start to go down, and you can hit liquidity traps. Now, why is this important? Well, I don't know what else you guys have studied in so far, but in general, in this macro finance literature, when people talk about business cycles, like for example, when 2008 happened, one of the first frameworks that came out to make sense of 2008 was the Edgson-Krugman model. People have seen some of that work to some extent at least. Okay. And that was very useful. It helped me. I was working on the empirical side, and it helped me a lot to try and make sense of those things. But one frustrating thing about those models is that, yes, you can get a liquidity trap in those models. The story is very similar in some sense. You get like people who are spending cannot borrow anymore, so spending falls, and you try and lower interest rate to boost spending, but they are out of the market, so they cannot borrow anymore, and so you keep lowering interest rate until you hit zero lower bound. And now you're in a liquidity trap, right? And so now very slowly the economy tries to get out of liquidity trap, right? Because of price rigidities and so on. But price rigidities, remember, are never permanent. So ultimately prices adjust, wages, prices and so on, they adjust, and you get out of liquidity trap, number one. And number two, you go back to exactly the same equilibrium, the same interest rate, right? So those are two. So liquidity traps or slowdowns are always temporary. You go back and so on. And when you look at the data, it doesn't look like that. So these things have much more persistence. What we generally, since 2008 onwards, we have remained in very close to that zero lower bound situation, right? When the global economy was significantly away from it before 2008. So it looks like you're permanently in a new position, right? So that's why I'm highlighting this again. So it looks like you need more persistence. And this framework delivers that persistence, because the liquidity trap in this framework now is permanent. Because, again, it's the structural parameter of the economy has shifted because of higher inequality and higher level of debt. Is this clear? And so now it's really hard actually to get out of this. You can talk about debt relief and so on, and that does help. But again, for reasons I've already talked about, that's temporary actually. Okay, a little bit about the formalization. It's a really simple formalization, as I mentioned earlier. So I can give you a little bit more formal intuition, which I like. I think it's useful. All this non-homotheticity that I was talking about, all that means is take a traditional log utility function. So the standard discount rate rho, delta is just probability of death. The thing that we are adding that gives you that non-homotheticity is the part in red, which is that you now also care about, it's like wealth in the utility function. You also care about the assets that you have accumulated. But you just rig the marginal utility of wealth such that it becomes a luxury good. That is to say, the richer you are, the more you want to save. It kind of makes sense, right? If you don't have enough to eat. So initially, your consumption marginal utility is really high, but that declines at a rate faster than the V function. And so if you're rich enough, the V starts to dominate the consumption, and you want to accumulate more and more. Right? So it's just a very simple, the most simple way you can think of. Now, again, you can microfound it in 20 different ways, but it all boils down to something like this. You can write down the Euler equation. That's just the usual Euler equation, except that now you have this marginal utility of wealth that I talked about earlier. And as I've said, so the more unequal the economy is, so there are going to be these two kinds of individuals in this economy, savers and spenders. And as always, it's only the savers Euler equation that matters, right? Because spenders are just spending. They are always on a corner solution. So whatever their borrowing constraint is, they borrow up to that, they spend, and then savers Euler equation determines the rate of interest. Again, very standard stuff, except that we now have non-homotheticity. And so that gives us, we can show everything graphically. So what I'm plotting here is, first of all, I'm showing you what happened in a standard model. Like if you take out that V term, take out the wealth inequality. This is a standard model in the long run, right? So I'm not talking about transition dynamics. I'm just focusing on the long run. This is something that all of you have seen, right? Remember, what is the interest rate? Discount rate, right? That's what happens. R equals rho. No matter what you do, you always go back to R equals rho. So that is what it means to say that everybody has the same propensity to save out of permanent income. For the you can think of that as savers supply schedule, like they are supplying credit or savings supply schedule. You can think of that, you can call it that, but it's also their indifference curve, right? Because that's always their indifference curve. They always go up to R equals rho if preferences are homothetic, right? And borrowers, remember, these are the sort of this always on corner solution guys. The lower the interest rate is, the more they want to borrow, right? So it relaxes. They can borrow more, and then so it always has this downward sloping shape. Lower the interest rate, the more they can borrow, so the higher the credit demand is, right? So what is credit supply and demand in a standard model? The intersection of these two. Is this clear? That's what I'm plotting here. That's macro finance, right? It's the supply of credit and the demand for credit. It's always at that point. And inequality, you can shift inequality around. Nothing changes. The red line does not shift as I change inequality in this economy. As opposed to what I just showed you in the previous slide, if we introduce the V term, the key thing that changes, the borrower stuff is still the same. The key thing that changes is, forget the dotted red line, or actually forget the solid red line for a moment. The red line before becomes the dotted red line now, which is to say it becomes downward sloping. That's the key thing. Why does the savings supply schedule become downward sloping? Well, the reason for that is non-homotheticity. If I've labeled x-axis as debt, but I could have also labeled it asset, right? What is debt for borrowers is asset for because I'm showing both, right? Borrowers and savers. So you can also think of debt as assets. If I want savers in long run steady state, once again, right? Those are the only points I'm showing. If we want them all else equal to hold more asset, that means they are going to be richer. Interest rate has to be lower to keep them indifferent in that consumption saving decision, right? Because the richer they are, the more so all else equal it has. So that's one way of thinking about it. So that's why it's downward sloping. Now the other implication of downward sloping supply curve is that now when inequality rises, so let's say we are at the green point is our pre-2008. Sorry, not 2008 is not important here. It's not business cycle. Remember, it's long run. 1980 is the green dot, And then inequality all of a sudden, for whatever reason, and again, that's a big debate on it. I have nothing intelligent to say on that. Other people have done very nice work on that, but could be technology, could be globalization, could be tax changes, a bunch of that stuff. Inequality starts to rise. Now the big difference is that that saving supply schedule will no longer remain the same. And in fact, it will shift down. Why? Because now the rich are richer as a share of the economy. Everything is normalized to like the size of the economy. So now they are richer in relative terms. And as a result of that, given their preferences, saving is a luxury good, right? Remember, they would want to save more, but that's not possible for the same level of debt or asset in the economy. So the interest rate, the new indifference curve interest rate must be lower. And that's the reason that this curve shifts down in response to rising inequality. So what's the new equilibrium? That's the red line. And notice something, that two things are happening. Again, this is long run equilibrium. R star is falling, interest rate, and debt is rising. Okay, so you get this prediction of co-movement of rising inequality, falling R star or long run interest rate, and rising debt to GDP. You can also think of that as broadly as financialization of the economy, right? So all of those things are happening at the same time, and this is a model that explains all of them with sort of this one common force. And again, typical models, so you'll have to come up with a separate story for debt and a completely separate story for the interest rate. As you know, that's not very exciting, right? You need parsimonious models to explain what is happening. So now we have a story. That's why I called it macro finance in the long run. We have one possible story that is linking real and financial variables. What's the real variable here? That's the interest rate, an important one. And then the financial obviously is the level of leverage or debt in the economy. Yes?
How do you know the relative slopes of these schedules? It seems important, right?
Yeah. So we do parameterize it, so that's where it becomes a sort of a function of how strong that force is that is making people save more. Obviously, the stronger it is, the more it's going to dip down. Otherwise, it's going to look, so that's the intuition. And so what you can do is, so we talk about some of that in the paper. There's been empirical work that talks about, like the one I showed, like how much more they want to save as they become richer. That essentially sort of, so that will determine the relative slope of this line. That's. Having said that, I think the main, I'm generally averse to doing that anyways, but I wouldn't take the quantification of just the model itself too seriously. The main point is kind of this conceptual point of trying to explain this force in the background, and whether we can detect the implications of that force in the data. I'm going to turn to that in a minute. Okay, the other thing I want to highlight is that once you have this framework, it actually explains something else, which was kind of a puzzle, at least in my mind, which is not only does interest rate fall, and this is a pure indebted demand effect actually, not only does interest rate fall if inequality rises, that kind of now sounds very obvious now, hopefully, right? Of course it does. But actually there's something else. Let's hold inequality constant now. So let's say we are living in a world with, it doesn't matter, let's say the dotted red line, right? So keep inequality fixed. There's another very interesting implication of this framework now. Let's do something like a financial liberalization experiment. Any idea what a financial liberalization experiment would look like in this picture? Exactly, right? exactly. One, or at least one way of, that the two of us seem to agree on, one way of thinking about financial liberalization is that for the same sort of structural parameters, you can borrow more. Maybe it's some technology that allows me to collateralize more of my future income, right? Because of whatever, people can follow me on apps and punish me if I do crazy things, whatever it might be. So because of some new technology, more of my future income is collateralizable. What does that mean from the borrower's perspective? It's a shift to the right. Is this clear? Now, but what is important here is the identity of the borrowers. The borrowers always tend to be the non-rich people, not the super wealthy, right? We all know, by the way, that roughly speaking, the bottom 50% of the population is not borrowing. That's fine. What matters is the relative rank of borrowers versus the lenders, right? So let's try and do that. So let's keep this line fixed. Inequality is not changing. Shift so you're on the green equilibrium. Shift this outward, and let's say it shifts up to this much. The new equilibrium will be very similar. Lower interest rate, higher debt. This is a pure indebted demand effect. Because all you have done is added more debt on this economy. Well, now, remember that force? Because when they have to pay back that debt, it's a transfer back. But now it's only possible to do that transfer back if interest rate is lower. Otherwise, it's too much, and the economy will not equilibrate to the same output level, which is assumed to be, someone asked that. Supply side is exogenous here, right? So there's just an endowment economy, again, to keep things simple. Okay? So why was this a puzzle? Because that's what when we have seen these waves of financial liberalization, people borrow more and more, and yet interest rate falls. And it's that intuition, that's the weight of debt. And it's actually now that you think about it, it's sort of almost obvious as well. When people talk about, and you saw that in this discussion of, and this is where that monetary policy question becomes important as well. Central banks did try and raise rates pre-pandemic, but they will kind of get slapped by the markets. Because demand will react too quickly. Because a lot of that demand is coming from people who kind of need low-cost credit to continue financing their consumption patterns. Okay. All right. So is this stuff relevant empirically? There are many different ways one can think of that, and obviously we are trying to think in as many ways as possible. But here is just some aggregate patterns. First of all, as I said, if you look at the post-80s environment, debt. Now, I didn't talk about government debt at all, but you have to. How will you think of government here? By the way, any ideas? There are many different ways you can think of it, but any quick ideas how I can introduce, to keep things simple, I didn't introduce government. How can government help here? Say that again? Well, it's an excellent point, and it's true. Tax policy matters a lot. But let's put that aside. I was thinking of government as a borrower and spender. This black line has people like you and I in it, right? If I introduce a government kind of does not have borrowing constraints the same way we do because of its taxation authority, right? So I can actually kind of bring in a government and, in a way, shift the black line around to the right by increasing the borrowing capacity, bringing the government in. So in that sense, you can bring a role of the government, right? It doesn't really change anything. It continues to have the same indebted demand force. Is this clear? So the government does not change any of the, except that's not true. Okay? And that's going to be a different paper. I'll talk about it, why it's not true. It's not true because governments are special in one so that's actually very interesting. We didn't initially fully realize it when we wrote the initial version of the paper, but then we realized it, but we also realized you can't talk about it in this paper, so we wrote a separate paper on that, right? So I'm going to talk about that. But there's something, it's actually very intuitive to talk about the government in this framework. But for now, you can obviously see that the general intuition is true here, which is the typical Keynesian intuition. Government can come in, they can borrow and spend more, and that can help generate demand, right? Except if I keep everything else the same, like we are all doing right now, the government has the same problem of indebted demand, right? Unless something is different, which is actually factually true. So, and that's sort of, I'll talk about that, promise, but not right now. Let me just keep going. So I'll come back to government. So government it doesn't change anything if we assume government is kind of like has the same borrowing rate as the private sector. That's kind of the hint, right? Then nothing changes. But actually government can borrow at a cheaper rate than the private sector. That changes things. Is this clear? I'm going to come back to that. Okay. But again, to come back to sort of the broader empirical implications, there is this substitutability between private debt, private, like think of that as household debt, and government debt. That's why I'm putting those two together and combining those two. You need debt to generate demand. That's the common theme. As an inequality rises, you need to borrow from the rich to spend, whether it's the private sector or the government. That's kind of the common link. And so the broader prediction would be that debt to GDP will rise, especially government plus household debt, which is debt to finance demand. Okay, this, by the way, is another important dimension I want to highlight here, which is that typically, again, when you do like Econ 101 kind of presentations, you will rationalize debt as like financing investment, right? The typical story, somebody has a good idea, like a firm, they try and borrow from the banks. Households have excess savings, they put it in the bank, and the bank lends that out. So debt or finance in that story is financing the supply side of the economy. Notice I've deliberately shut that channel down. And the whole story is about financing the demand side of the economy. And notice now we do have theories of that, but those are typically, again, think of, that's why I mentioned like Iagari style models. Those are all stories of you have some short run like labor income risk or something like that you're trying to smooth out, hedge against, and so you're using credit markets for that. That's not going to give us this force, right? And so anyways, I think more broadly, trying to think of why finance is that important for the demand side of the economy is another way to motivate why thinking about these dimensions is kind of useful. All right, so now we can explain these patterns of rising inequality, rising debt to GDP, and falling real rate that I just talked about. So that's good. One can do a deeper dive. This is not great identification. You could question that, and that would be legitimate. There's a lot of a lot more is going on in the time series, right? But still, we're explaining co-movement of 3 variables, not just 2. But you can do more. So this is, we could try to construct a cross-sectional experiment using states across the US. And the prediction of this indebted demand framework would be that states that experience larger rise in inequality, which is measured on the x-axis by change in income going to the top 6%. For just measurement reasons, you can't measure top 1%. We can only measure top 6%. So states that experienced a larger rise in inequality between 1980 and most recent available year, they are also the states that saw a larger rise in wealth to income ratio. Okay? In the aggregate. And number 2, what you're seeing in the screen right now, that rise in wealth to income is entirely driven by the top 6%. Okay? This is exactly the prediction of the indebted demand framework, that in a sort of a small open economy, which is what a US state is, if you changed inequality in one state more than the other, the state that becomes more unequal will have more saving in the top. But they can save, obviously they are going to lend to anywhere in the US. So it will show up as higher aggregate wealth for that state, for the same level of income. Right? So that's true, number one. And number two, that wealth is really getting accumulated at the top 6%, not for the rest. That's what these two graphs are showing you. Okay? So this is a bit tighter identification relative to time series. So that seems true in the data as well. Yeah?
Ask a question. So in the previous graph, if you plotted the wealth to income for the really bottom of the distribution, would you get a downward sloping curve? Because like there's a wealth accumulation for the people at the bottom.
Yes, I think your answer is in here, but if not, feel free to come back to me. In the next paper I'm going to talk about, where we do look at individuals, the tax record data. So this is, again, a paper, Saving Blood of the Rich. Many of you may have seen like the tax record, like the original size Piketty work, and then the follow-up number of papers. We use that data set, the tax record data set, to look at saving blood of the rich. Why? Because when you can observe this repeated cross-section, that's what that tax record data gives you for the top 1% versus the rest. You can construct these kind of pseudo panels, if you will, of these cohorts. And there is this simple formula. Maybe is there chalk here? So if I can, through tax records, you can estimate someone's wealth, because I know your dividend income, I know your interest income. So using some capitalization rate, I can back out your equity and bonds, and then there's some estimates of real estate as well, things like that. So that's all the methodology that people have built over time, right? How can you measure saving from that? Well, because if I observe your wealth at time t, and I observe your wealth, so what is wealth at time t? This is your wealth at time t minus 1 times, let me just call that capital gain on that wealth, right? That you may have experienced, could be negative, but typically is positive, plus the saving that you did. I'm just going to use the timing conventions. It's your total saving in t minus 1. Is this clear? Like that's sort of your intertemporal equation that I can measure. So if I know your WT minus 1 and I know your WT, I can back out saving as long as I can measure capital gains. So that's the methodology that people use to back out. Now, the important thing, however, is the reason I'm writing down this formula is not because the formula is particularly interesting, but because of a measurement thing that is super important. How do you measure this capital gain? This capital gain is not the usual capital gain. Like, of course, you can measure capital gain if I ask you that question for S&P 500, right? You can just read it off the index. But that's not what capital gain is here. Can anyone guess why not? That's not pi. That's easily measurable, but it's not pi in this equation.
Do we need to subtract tax from expenses?
No.
Is like real estate and private businesses really important?
That's true, but let's say, let's say there's only S&P 500, just to keep things simple. Pi is not capital gain for S&P 500, and increasingly so in recent years and decades. Why is that? So this turns out to be super important when we get to measurement, right? So here's another plug in general for all of you. Never underestimate the power of accounting and measurement, right? Like it's so boring, right, to think of that. But it's really super important, because some of the most influential work is just about measuring things right and linking it back to economic theory. This is what this number actually is. It actually, the way accounting works, it doesn't represent so on and so forth. So this is a plug, just as general. I think people, we get too mesmerized by models and all the math and all this stuff. But sometimes the diamond really is in sort of the most boring stuff, which is, accounting and measurement. All right, so here's maybe a quick, maybe not the most interesting, but one example I think of that, which is the reason S&P capital gain is not pi is because, remember, I'm trying to calculate saving of the individual who's holding S&P 500. And people like Bill Gates and others, over time, they have been holding more and more of their savings through corporations, through retained earnings. So there's a lot of corporate saving that is held, and that is part of the capital gain. So the more cash Microsoft holds, all else equal, the more its value rises. So you want to strip the capital gain that we observe, and you want to say differently, that saving that is blocked inside W, I need to take that out and attribute it to those who own that wealth. Is this clear? So the paper has full detail of, so now this becomes tricky because now there are all these other issues people mentioned. By the way, one reason they do that is for tax reasons, because they have to pay lower taxes or no taxes as long as that capital gain is unrealized, right? So that's why they like to keep their savings inside corporations as opposed to the corporation paying it out to them as dividends and so on. Okay, yeah, so the paper has more details on that, and so this issue is more relevant for, like, obviously S&P, but not relevant for bonds for kind of the usual reason. It's fixed income claim and so on. But now for bonds, you need to worry about write-offs, because you should not count that as kind of a dissaving, because if it's a write-off, and so you need to do those corrections, and so properly. And so all of that is done in the paper. Those details are important, right? So do look for that. But anyways, once you do that, I'll come back to this one, but let me first show this one, this chart. This is the share of share of savings. Let me say, saving of these different group, top 1, next 9, and bottom 90 as a share of national income. And this is where I think I'm partly answering your question that you were asking. Tell me if I'm not. So now you can see that the size of savings of the top 1% versus the bottom 90. Now you can split bottom 90 into bottom 50 and the next. This is really coming from the next 40. Because as I said, bottom 50 are kind of out of, they are not even borrowing. So it's really about the 50th to 90th group. Their share, so they have been dissaving relative to zero is like where they were in 1980. So relative to what they were saving, they have been dissaving more and more. And so again, the details are in the paper, but you can ask this question of how they are dissaving. It's actually kind of interesting how they are dissaving. One important way through which they are dissaving is that the real estate that they used to hold is becoming more and more valuable, and they are just borrowing more and more against it. So that's one way they are dissaving. Okay? But what you realize, some sort of interesting facts when you do those, again, accounting exercises that I was talking about. We saw this huge housing boom during the 2000s, right? Maybe one surprising fact. Throughout that housing boom, and we called it subprime and so on, the bottom 90% did not increase their holding of real estate. All that was happening was real estate was becoming more and more expensive. They were trying to buy more of it, but they had to pay more, and so they were leveraging more and more. So they actually never got more housing. This, by the way, this is another very interesting question. We talk about, okay, give people loans so home ownership increases. It really doesn't look like it happened in the data at all. And I think for reasons that it mostly leads to price appreciation, and it helps those who already have the asset, not those who want to get into the asset, for example. Now, why is that? Because we have huge zoning restrictions and so on. So that really, inelasticity of investment that I was talking about earlier, that's really a very important how inelastic that is. And it interacts with these kind of policies. Anyways, I'm running out of time. I do want to talk about the government. Let me skip this other paper and quickly talk about some policy implications. So one thing about monetary policy, and then I'll say one other thing about fiscal policy that I alluded to earlier. So just the one quick thing about monetary policy. Remember this thought experiment we did, financial liberalization. You add more debt, it puts downward pressure on the interest rate. This model right now was just like a real model. Let's make it a New Keynesian model with some price rigidity. You can do that, and you get another interesting sort of side thing in that, which is very similar to the financial liberalization experiment. And that is, if you now, what happens in a model with price rigidity? Well, you can create short-term booms, right, through monetary policy. That's the idea, right? Intuitively, you can reduce R star temporarily. That's essentially what New Keynesian stuff does. Is this clear? You can change real R, but only in the short run. Long run, you have monetary neutrality. What happens? You create more debt because people can borrow more. And now, because it's just you're temporarily lowering R star. It's a standard New Keynesian experiment. Inequality is not rising and so on. It's just constant. But because of this indebted demand force, now the economy to go back to the same equilibrium, it will take significantly longer. Right? So you do have even business cycle implications of the indebted demand force. Is this clear? Because of the same dynamics that I mentioned earlier. Now, the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop on fiscal policy, is there is this very interesting, so we have a separate paper on that, Goldilocks theory of fiscal policy. What is important is that the interest rate that government borrows, so that's what I'm calling R here, is that interest rate. The interest rate that government is able to borrow is lower than the interest rate that the private sector is able to borrow at. That's just an empirical fact. And people have called that like convenience yield, or used other names for that. Governments are special. Once you allow for that, so not only that, but actually it's less than G. I should mention. So R is actually not just less than the private rate, but it's less than G. What's the private rate? If you write down the standard formula, the private rate is like G plus rho, right? That's the standard result that comes out. It's always greater than G. It has to be. Everyone with me? So this convenience yield makes government debt R less than G. Now that's super important actually. I didn't have to say it because it's sort of always there. The interest rate that we were talking about, that private sector was borrowing at, was greater than G. If you allow for an interest rate less than G, something very interesting happens actually in at least the indebted demand framework, which is it's borrowing, government borrowing actually acts like a wealth tax, which works very well in this framework. So wealth tax, talking about solutions which are permanent, unlike debt jubilee, if you introduce a wealth tax, that can get you out of, that can raise R star. Because you're taxing this saving as a luxury good for those individuals who are doing that at the very top end. Right? So it raises R star, and so that sort of helps you push out of liquidity trap. But there's another way to kind of, if R is less than G, so we don't understand why people are willing to hold government debt at such cheap, but if they are, the government can actually take advantage of that, and so borrowing is like a wealth tax, right? So that introduces actually this notion of what, I mean, MMT is just sort of garbage as a framework and theory, so I don't want to advertise that. But that intuition, actually you can understand that it holds actually in certain sort of regions of the economy. And in particular, there is such a notion that you can take advantage of R less than G by getting something for nothing. That is to say, you can actually run a permanent deficit, a higher permanent primary deficit, without ever having to raise taxes and so on, because R is less than G for a while. But it's not, R is not less than G forever, and the reason is that people have estimated this elasticity, what is this thing called, phi, which is that as governments borrow more and more, their R does rise. So there is a cost that you have to pay for borrowing too much. And so that's the trade-off that this paper solves for. Anyways, I will stop here and again just leave you with this broader question of how to think of macro economy and the financial side of things in the long run. It's a harder question to investigate, empirically especially, because you don't get as many data points and so on, but it's actually super important. Given this long-run trend that we see global economies facing. So I think it's a fascinating question, and I really encourage you to think about those related questions. All right, thank you very much.